All right, so we are now looking at the southern half of this kingdom, which is obviously much smaller by tribe count. But as I said, all of the faithful, as certainly is recorded in Chronicles, the faithful did come south and started to live their lives in the southern kingdom rather than the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom went from about 970 to 722 BC. And so the southern kingdom will go a bit further, and well, in fact, it still actually in some ways continues today, unlike the northern kingdom. But let's take a look at what happened with the southern kingdom. The lead tribe of the southern kingdom is Judah, which is obviously the tribe of David, the tribe of the Messiah, tribe of Christ. And so it continues on. Now, just so you're aware, they didn't always engage in battle with each other. Sometimes they were allies against some other enemy, and sometimes one of those northern or southern tribes would ally with like Egypt or someone else against the other northern tribe or the southern tribe. So they acted like they had no relationship with one another. If it was expedient for them to join forces south and northern kingdoms, they would. And if it was expedient to join forces with someone else and attack the southern kingdom from the north or the northern kingdom from the south, they would do those kind of things as well. Okay. But Judah also had about 20 kings, or lists 20 kings in the southern kingdom. And we get a little bit better report card from these 20 kings. 5 is referred to specifically as doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So they were doing right. That doesn't mean they were perfect. Doesn't mean they were fully committed to doing what God's will is. But in general, God could at least say that these 5 kings did what was right in his eyes, certainly compared to the north and certainly compared to the 15 other kings of the south. Okay, so of course that 15 did evil. So if you're taking count, that's 40 total kings from Solomon to the time of the exile, and 5 did what was right, 1 did marginally okay, and the other 16 or 36 or whatever, what is it, 26, did terrible in the sight of the Lord. So 6, so 34. Yeah. So 34 were awful overall, and many much worse than others. Like Ahab is probably the worst of the worst of the worst. But you just get not a very good report card. So the southern kingdom then falls. So after all these succession of different kings, some doing what was right, most not, the southern kingdom falls under Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, pretty well-known names in the Old Testament. Nebuchadnezzar, the king that conquered Israel or Judah, and Babylon is the nation state or the empire that ultimately does the conquering. It started in 605 BC, so the northern kingdom fell in 722, and this kingdom falls more than 100 years later in 605. And what we'll see when we get to the prophets is some of the prophets who prophesied after the fall of the northern kingdom were prophesying to Judah and saying, look what happened to the nation to the north. That's going to happen to us if we don't get our lives straight. And it's exactly what did happen to them. But God was telling them and warning them, you don't have to go that route. But they continued to fall. And so in 605, Nebuchadnezzar has what's called the first siege of Jerusalem. And so he sets up just some of these final kings of Judah. He sets up Jehoiakim as a vassal king, meaning he was under Babylon's control. What Babylon said is what he was supposed to do. So you keep the title of king, and you have some authority in your nation, but I rule over you. You still pay tribute to me. You still do what I say to do. And so Jehoiakim is set up as a vassal king, as it's referred to. Daniel and others were carried away after this first siege, and this begins what's referred to in Scripture as the servitude of the nations of 70 years. And that's exactly what Jeremiah had prophesied when he was telling the kings of Israel, your leadership is going to lead the nation of Judah into captivity, and it's going to be 70 years. And it was literally 70 years to the day that they were in captivity. So Jeremiah's prophecy was perfectly accurate and confirmed. Their servitude as a nation, having lost their freedom to be a nation without, under God's authority and not some other ruler, was a 70-year captivity to the day. And Jeremiah tells them the reason why it's a 70-year captivity is because for 490 years you failed to keep the Sabbaths of the land. 1 year in 7, they were supposed to let the land lay fallow. They were supposed to do no work. They were supposed to observe the Torah, the law, which required a 1-year break every 7 years. And they didn't do it. So God says, after a period of 490 years of failing to keep the Sabbath of the land, I'm going to make this land have a 70-year Sabbath where you're out of it. So because you didn't pay me, you didn't offer to me the seventh year for 490 years. Okay. So it's exactly to the day of what happened. Then the second siege of Nebuchadnezzar happens in 598 BC. He's trying to deal with the situation, and so there's more of this stuff that's happening here. He sets up Zedekiah again as a vassal king the second time. There's a couple other kings in the mix there as well. But then the third siege, they continue to rebel. The nation of Judah continues to not get the story straight. The prophets, every prophet of God is telling them, don't resist. God is using Nebuchadnezzar to judge you. Don't resist, and life will go better for the nation. But they resisted. They tried to make peace treaties with Egypt and all kinds of things, and they end up falling and going into. And so by the time you get to the third siege, Nebuchadnezzar levels the city. He destroys Jerusalem. So the beautiful temple that Solomon built, he destroys, levels, flattens. It's done. The whole city is destroyed. And there's an interesting account of all of this in Ezekiel where, like, the Spirit of God is struggling with the idea that the temple is going to be destroyed. So he kind of, it's described as reluctantly departs from the temple before Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys it. But because the people were rebellious, refused to hear the word of the Lord, the city was destroyed and the temple was destroyed. They were going into captivity for 70 years. God had already promised them that was going to happen. But the temple and the city and the walls didn't have to die, didn't have to be broken down. But because they rebelled, this happened. Okay, and you can, the Ezekiel. And Jeremiah is the weeping prophet, and he's describing all of this kind of stuff happening. And then Ezekiel seen from Jerusalem is seeing the same kind of events take place in his generation. And you can tell Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they're heartbroken over the fact that God's words are being rejected in favor of false prophets. And it's happening. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel, more than anybody, were dealing with false prophets in their day. Always telling the king, oh, sure, God would never judge us. We're his chosen people. God would never bring us into captivity. We're his chosen people. And Jeremiah and Ezekiel are saying, no, it's going to happen. God will judge. And he did, okay, just as they were true prophets and the rest of them were false prophets. Big lessons to learn there about people speaking for God, with tickling people's ears and telling them what they want to hear rather than what the message and the word of the Lord actually is. So in 539, we do see, so the third siege happens in 586, and that begins a whole separate 70-year period, is referred to as the Desolations of Jerusalem, which also lasted 70 years to the day, meaning from the time Jerusalem was flattened and destroyed, or razed, if you like that term, to the time when they were sent back in and started the reconstruction process of the city, was exactly 70 years to the day. So the 70 years of the desolation lasted 70 years to the day, and the 70 years of desolations happened for 70 years. Okay, so servitude of the nations and desolations of Jerusalem, two different things, both 70-year periods, not the same 70-year time period. They didn't start and end at the same time. So then in 539 BC, Babylon, under Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, falls to the Medes and the Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus II. And then in 538 BC, we get the first return of the Jews to Jerusalem to end the servitude of the nation and bring that back. So Anyway, that's the major history. So in all, if you're thinking kind of big picture, thinking Israelite like a Jew, big events that happen were obviously David is king. Well, I mean, obviously, call and the life of Abraham and the 12 tribes of Israel and all that, Moses and the giving of the law. The next big event is David. And the next big event after David is the fall of Jerusalem and all of that happened in the 70 years of captivity is the big event. So they call it the years of the exile. Okay, and so you'll see in your commentaries or in some writings or things that you see, you will see the term exile or pre-exile, exile, and post-exile. It's referring to the 70-year period. And so pre-exile is obviously from David to before the exile, the 70-year period. And then the exile period, exilic period, if you will, with Daniel and all that happens in Babylon is that 70-year period. And then you'll see post-exile or post-exilic like prophets and events that take place after the exile, after Israel or Judah returns back to the nation, back to their own land. So those are big events, big milestone markers along the timeline of history is Abraham, Moses, David, and the exile. Okay, those are very high watermarks when we talk about Scripture and the history of Israel, the history of Judah. Okay, and so as we're looking at this information, we're clearly, as I've been mentioning, we're talking about the events are recorded in 1st and 2nd Kings. We also have events recorded in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And you may have, as you've read through Scriptures, may wonder, why do I have two books that seem to be the same information? Why do I have 1st and 2nd Kings? Why do I have 1st and 2nd Chronicles? Okay, let's talk about the purpose and scope of these different. First off, in the original, they were just one scroll. It wasn't called 1st and 2nd Kings or 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's just Kings or Chronicles because they had to break it up because of the length of it. But it's just generally referred to as just Kings or Chronicles in the Scriptures themselves. So 1st and 2nd Kings. So you get 1st and 2nd Samuel dealing with David. 1st and 2nd Kings is basically all the kings, those 40 kings that we looked at after David and after Solomon. And so what it provides is an accurate, unbiased account of the kingdom years of both the northern and southern kingdoms, after Solomon. Okay, and I'll read that again. Accurate, unbiased, general accounts, the good, the bad, and the ugly of everything that happened with those 40 kings. Okay. And it's presented from a civil and political viewpoint. What happened? Who was the king? What were their battles? What was their victory? Who took over when they died? All the stuff that happens. It's from a very matter-of-fact, civil, political kind of description. And a lot of times it'll say something like, and the rest of the acts of this king are written in some other book that is not canonical, not part of the Bible. And so you might find some historical information about them, but the biblical account of them is just this unbiased, accurate account in 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay. And so it really documents, the 1st and 2nd Kings, or the book of Kings, documents the failures of God's people and the resulting problems they had. I guess we don't need to say resulting as a result, but documents they had as a result of their failures. Okay, that's what Kings is all about, 1st and 2nd Kings. So Chronicles is different. Chronicles is presented to us as an idyllic account of Judah's history, not all of Israel, the southern tribe, the southern kingdom of Judah. Idyllic account of Judah's history, the house of Israel mostly, is out of scope in this concept. Chronicles may mention, this happened during the time of this king from the north, just from a chronological point of reference. Okay, they're not the books of Chronicles are not trying to tell you what happened in the northern kingdom and why they fell. It's trying to tell you all the good stuff that happened in Israel during the times of these kings, 5 good and 15 bad. Okay, it's from an idyllic perspective, saying, and it's written post-exile. Remember, I just said these high watermarks in these terms. Written post-exile as an encouragement to those who had never lived under those time periods and lived under those kings, and say, let's get back as a nation to what God has called us to be. God has blessed us so abundantly as a nation. Let's read the accounts of God's blessings on the nation of Judah. Okay, not unbiased, it's biased. It's not without accuracy, but it's leaving out a lot of the faults and failures. What you won't see in Chronicles as nearly as much is David's sins, as Solomon's problems, as all this. You're going to see the high points of these lives of the kings and the nation, not the low points. I hope that makes sense. Okay, that's why we have 1st and 2nd Kings. God's not hiding the fact that all these kings had problems and all kinds of things took place. And that's why the northern kingdom got conquered in 722. And that's why the southern kingdom got conquered in 605. But Chronicles is telling a story about hope and restoration and God's promises. Let's get back to that level of living is what the author of Chronicles is attempting to encourage his people to know and understand. So it presents life in this time from a spiritual and a moral viewpoint, far more than the narrative, far more than this happened and this is the result, positive or negative of it. Written as an encouragement to the Jews returning from the Babylonian captivity, so clearly post-exile, okay, in its scope and its message. It highlights the best kings of Judah and their successes, not the evil kings and their failures so much. Okay. An additional focus is given to the glorious temple compared with Kings. So Kings describes the events of Solomon building God's temple. You're going to find a much more effusive description of the temple in Chronicles than you will in Kings. It was glorious. Let's rebuild the temple again with the glory that Solomon built it with. Okay, and so there's a focus on the glory of God's temple, much more so than in the book of Kings, or 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay. All right, and then we start to see, so now we're post-exile, or we're moving out of this, this period of time. So we went from David's kingdom and Solomon's kingdom, a divided kingdom, 10 tribes of the north, 2 tribes of the south, and then conquered both kingdoms. Now we've got Judah having spent 70 years in exile. They're coming out of it, and we're going to look at the narrative books that talk about this post-exile period of time. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, 538 BC with Zerubbabel, we start the process of rebuilding the temple, and the focus is specifically on rebuilding the temple. So the events of Esther occur, so the book of Esther pops in here in the process. And so Esther occurs during the period between the first and second returns of the Jews. They left in stages at the beginning of the 70-year period. They returned in stages after the end of the 70-year period. I don't want anybody to get the misconception that when Israel got free to return to Jerusalem or Judah, that all of those who identified as Jews went back. In fact, I think it was less than 10%, maybe barely 5%. The rest of them got really comfortable living in Babylon and did not want to go back. Okay, so, but some of them did. And so you had a couple of waves of groups coming back to Jerusalem from Babylon. And so that second returning remnant happens in about 458 BC. And we see this as this happens under the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus, and it's recorded in Ezra 7, 1 through 28, Daniel 9, 25. There's this prophetic trigger so this was long after Daniel has written his prophecies, but it's referred to as that prophetic trigger. When you see these events take place, the rebuilding of the walls, rebuilding of the temple, under Artaxerxes' decree is when the events start. And that starts a chain reaction for Daniel's prophecy that leads directly to the Messiah, the 69 or the 69 weeks of the 70 weeks from that time to Jesus Christ coming into Jerusalem. So Ezra, the book of Ezra, and the man himself leads this remnant in, and the focus is on the returning Jews and their spiritual and moral living. They need to live for God. If they don't want to suffer the same fate as their ancestors, they're going to have to start living for God. They're going to have to start returning to Him and living a spiritual life dedicated to God rather than the idolatrous and rebellious life that led them into captivity in the first place. Okay, so that's Ezra. We're still, in a narrative section of books here, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, right? And so Nehemiah, his dating is about 444 BC. And he was a cupbearer to the king. He stood beside the king, Artaxerxes, and he tells him about the struggles his homeland is having with their enemies while they're trying to rebuild their city and rebuild the temple. And the king gives them financial incentives and the authority to protect themselves so they could defend the city, they could start building the wall. He gave them all the permission to do all of this. And that's key to Israel being back in their land when, for the next 400 years until the time of Christ. Okay, really critical on all of that. So as the focus in Nehemiah is the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem to give them that protection, give them that security from their enemies who were taunting them and challenging them and coming and attacking them the whole time in the whole story of the book of Nehemiah. There's another registration of the people or a census of the people, but what we see greatly is that a revival does in fact break out. We see a revival under Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah is kind of combined there. We see this revival of the people, and the people really did seek to turn back to the Lord. They read the law. They understood what God required of them. They wanted to start living right for God for some period of time. And actually, maybe more than most of their ancestors, we see that group of people living for God all the way into the time of Christ. Now, Pharisees, Sadducees, by the time you get to the New Testament, they have all kinds of faults and failures. But you see in the time of Christ, Jews who know what it means to be a Jew. For hundreds of years prior to the exile, Jews they never read the law. They couldn't find the book of the law. They had no idea what it meant to serve God. They had no idea what it required of Him. But under Ezra and Nehemiah and this rebuilding process, they read the law. They agreed once again to commit themselves to living for God. And so by the time you get to Jesus and the apostles and the disciples in the New Testament and the gospel accounts, you see a nation of Israel, a nation of Judah, who actually knows the scriptures. They've been studying them. They've been memorizing them. They've been living according to them in some capacity. Obviously, Jesus was frustrated, I guess if you can just put it that way, with what he saw in the nation and their deterioration. But it was far better than when Israel went into idolatry and fell to Assyria in 722, and when the kings who refused to obey God and his prophets fell in Judah in 605 BC. Much, much better, it seems, historically, from this mid-4th century up until the time of Christ. And of course, we won't talk about it much because the Bible doesn't talk about it, but like the Maccabean Revolt in 166, 65, they were, being a Jew was outlawed, but they revolted and came back and reestablished proper worship techniques and all that, so that that temple that Jesus taught and preached in the New Testament was standing and being rebuilt day by day over and over again, so that Christ had a place to call this is the house of God, and he could come in and demonstrate all his righteousness to Israel as a complete and cohesive nation, where they weren't from about 722 going towards the time of these post-exile events. And so all I want to make sure you understand here is that the post-exile, there was some really good fruit that came out of being exiled and rebuilding after the exile that really set the stage for Christ to be revealed in his time. Obviously at the turn of the BC to AD clock. Okay. All right. So that ends that whole section of narrative. So we've just basically taken a full tour of Israel's history. Now, if you're asking, well, wait a minute, isn't there about 400 years or so from this whole Ezra and Nehemiah stuff to Christ? Yeah. And there's no narrative book whatsoever that really covers that. Malachi is the last book. He's a prophet. We'll talk about him in the prophet section. I think about 385, if I have my memory correct at that. But there was really no writings. There's no prophets being given to God for approximately 400 years until the time of Christ. But God actually wasn't silent. And for those of you who were with me in any part of my Daniel studies, we looked at Daniel 11, basically verses 5 through 35. God gives this incredible level of precision detail about the nation of Israel until the time of Christ. And so God hadn't been silent because he already gave all the information the people needed to do to live until the Messiah came. But there was no new writings, no new revelation of God's word after Malachi, a little less than 400 years before Christ. Okay, so that covers the narrative. So we're out of that whole section from Genesis to Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Okay, all of that is this narrative section, and we've covered all of that. So roughly 4,000 years of history in what we've talked about in this class so far. Okay, all of that, obviously, and some of you think I've gone in a great level of detail, but obviously with however many books that is from Genesis to Esther or whatever, we've done our fair share to try and cover it as best as we can without getting so much deeper that this is a 6-year class. Okay, so. All right, so the next section of your notes, section 5, is when we switch into poetry. Yeah, Kim. Oh, live isn't working, Kevin? Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kim. All right, so in your notes, you now have section 5, that last section of the notes I gave you from the first day. And we're going to talk about poetry. So poetry in the Old Testament, and just move on through. So what's the whole point of the poetry section? So you've got Job and all the way through Song of Songs and all of that. You've got, what's the point of this? Why do, if you're a Christian, I hope you are, and you might say, well, I read the Bible because I want to get facts and information about God. What's this whole stuff about Job? What's this whole stuff about Psalms? And what's this whole stuff about Proverbs? Well, ultimately, I think what you'll see, the theme that runs through all of it is what the reason these books of wisdom and poetry are given to us is to teach us to trust God even during times of anguish and misery. Okay, so the narratives don't help us all that much. We can see God being gracious to David, as we spent a bunch of time talking about earlier today, right? We can see God being gracious to Abraham and giving him a son when he was 100 years old and all of that. But this is really about deep, deep, deep anguish, levels of misery and suffering, and wondering what God is doing when I can't see his hand directly working in my life in this moment. This is what the books of wisdom and poetry are for. So starting off with Job, if you're going to start talking about anguish and misery, let's talk about Job, okay? So in the book of Job, most people who recognize, in Christianity, kind of recognize Job as, oh yeah, there's that guy that suffered, right? The suffering of Job. Well, let's talk about it. So the background here is this. His life actually occurs much earlier than what we just finished talking about 2,000 years before Christ. Okay, so roughly the same contemporaneous level of life with Abraham. So probably lived a little bit before Abraham. It's circa, because there's references to cities and places and things like that kind of give us a clue as to when the time periods took place. It seems very much to be long before the law was given, and since there's no mention of Abraham of any kind in this, it possibly precedes him altogether. So some people refer to it as the oldest book of the Bible, and it may or may not, we don't know when it was written, but the story, the account of Job's life is older than Abraham. Okay, so if it was written during his lifetime, it would clearly be the oldest book of the Bible, because Moses wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy, and he wrote it about 1,400 years before Christ. So the events here are 2,000 years, so we don't know who wrote it. That's okay. That doesn't challenge our faith at all to not know who wrote it or when it was written. We know the accounts are about 2,000 years before Christ, clearly after the flood, clearly in the time frame at best, or no later than Abraham's life. So what we get here is the first